In early 2025, public attention on abductions shifted in a way we haven't seen before. On one side, the Pentagon's Office for UAP Reporting shared hundreds of new cases across a single reporting period, while emphasizing it has found no evidence of extraterrestrial beings or technology. On the other, civilian studies and whistleblower claims pushed abduction testimonies into mainstream discussions. Combined with clinical and technical findings from 2024 to 2025, the debate now looks less like fringe material and more like a coordinated research question. And the timing of these official releases makes the picture even more complicated. Government transparency milestones of 2025. Government transparency in 2025 stands out because the landscape didn't shift quietly. It changed in plain sight. The Pentagon's most recent reports weren't released years after public interest had cooled down. They arrived at the same time that claims of encounters, including abductions, were once again climbing. In the past, officials let long stretches pass with little more than silence or carefully worded deflections. This year, however, the conversation broadened. Agencies like the Pentagon's All-domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, disclosed totals in the hundreds. One reporting window alone logged 757 new cases, bringing the overall number of UAP incidents under review to more than 1,600. That spike in raw reporting numbers demanded response, not avoidance, and marks a departure from the caution that once defined these updates. What also distinguishes 2025 is how officials and researchers now frame the issue. It's not just a question of unusual objects on radar anymore. While AARO maintains its position that no verified evidence of extraterrestrial technology has been found, its data release coincided with fresh contributions from civilian and academic circles. In particular, survey-based projects, such as Canada's publicly funded Sky Canada initiative, have started gathering and publishing population-level data measuring sightings and public attitudes. These parallel efforts mean the story no longer ends at craft reports. It extends to the human side, who is reporting, how they describe encounters, and where those accounts are coming from. Some of these studies now include demographic notes, allowing researchers to track patterns across age, region, or background. This shift doesn't replace speculation with certainty, but it does redefine what counts as evidence worth archiving. But before we assign motives to the timing, let's check what the official reports actually say. In AARO's release, the emphasis is squarely on efficiency and structure, standardizing how incidents are reported, centralizing case files, and offering totals that highlight the scale of interest. From that perspective, the disclosures serve a practical function. Civilian surveys, however, widen the scope. Instead of focusing primarily on aviation safety or intelligence concerns, they ask basic questions about experiencers themselves. Who has had encounters? Where are these individuals located? How does one region compare against another? The combination of these worlds, formal defense data counting incidents and independent surveys exploring human details, explains why 2025 feels qualitatively different from earlier cycles of disclosure. That comparison also underscores why interpreting these developments is difficult. On the one hand, government publications build credibility by tabulating reports and providing totals that can be independently tracked over time. On the other, the surrounding academic and civilian work dives into territory that governments avoided for decades. Personal accounts, sociological breakdowns, and surveys of attitudes about the phenomenon. Seen from above, this creates a picture that's less about a single leak or revelation, and more about overlapping institutions recognizing they now hold adjacent pieces of a larger puzzle. Abductions, once pushed to the sidelines as unreliable narratives, are being indirectly drawn closer to the central conversation because the apparatus for collecting and publishing data has expanded in scope. The consequences of these shifts reach beyond research priorities. When experiencer responses begin appearing in official reports, even as footnotes or companion surveys, the wider community takes notice. That visibility generates momentum. NGOs, think tanks, and universities can point to government statistics and argue that similar methods should be applied to more sensitive claims, including abductions. Once the Pentagon's reports provided incident totals in the thousands, the threshold for avoiding the human dimension weakened. The logic was simple. If the issue is broad enough to yield hundreds of new incidents in a year, then clearly tens of thousands of people potentially hold relevant stories. Silence may no longer be a sustainable strategy. That's why timing matters. Abduction testimonies haven't only risen in number, they've diversified. Civilian and academic studies have documented this expansion, from urban centers to wider ethnic representation. This doesn't prove that the underlying phenomenon has changed, but it does show that the stigma around reporting, or at least the willingness to speak to surveyors, has shifted. The Pentagon isn't publishing a census of experiencers, but the environment of 2025 does feature interdisciplinary datasets aligning more closely than at any earlier point. Bringing those numbers forward at the same moment abduction claims are multiplying inevitably sharpens public attention. The design of AARO's system itself hints at recognition of that attention. From its inception, the office was charged with centralizing and standardizing how anomalous incidents are reported across the military and intelligence community. In practical terms, that meant a new infrastructure was required. Incoming channels for pilots, ground personnel, or intelligence staff, a central database, and accountability for tracking resolutions. The cumulative totals, over 1,600 cases reviewed, reflect that buildup. And when such volume becomes visible, the question emerges naturally: what kinds of encounters feed into these statistics? Sightings alone, or also the abduction-like accounts long omitted from official channels? Officially, AARO stresses it has evidence only of misidentifications, conventional craft, and natural phenomena. Yet the space around those reports is what draws new scrutiny. For researchers and experiencers alike, what matters is that a precedent was set. Government-funded institutions are now acknowledging abnormal encounters as reportable events, organizing data, and feeding it into regular updates. Civilian surveys then map the same terrain with different variables: age, ethnicity, and geography. Together they create a two-track system, one built on military accountability, the other built on public analysis. This alignment ensures that abductions, whether explicitly named or not, sit closer to the center of inquiry than at any point in the past several decades. Still, the core dilemmas remain. Did officials plan their timing to undercut years of pressure by choosing a moment when abduction claims were already trending upward? Or does the parallel rise of government statistics and survey findings suggest reactive momentum, where numbers force transparency rather than strategy? On one level, the answer doesn't matter. For the experiencers providing accounts and for researchers studying the reports, the outcome is identical. Their testimony is now contextualized within mainstream data ecosystems. On another level, disentangling motive from consequence remains important, because public trust depends on whether transparency feels staged or authentic. As the discussion branches outward, observers recognize that the issue is no longer just about lights in the sky. Once abductions are mentioned, even indirectly, through related demographic survey findings, the story shifts decisively into the human domain. That pivot carries its own unsettled weight. It takes a subject that once lived on the fringes and quietly integrates it into datasets supported by taxpayer oversight and institutional continuity. Whether or not it was intentional, the framing changed. Abductions are edging into recognized categories of data worth monitoring. All of this lays crucial groundwork for the next step, considering who, exactly, is showing up in these reports. Government statistics give us case totals. Civilian surveys suggest the categories behind those numbers. Together they sharpen a picture of an experiencer population that looks different now than it did in previous decades. That observation raises fresh questions about whether the phenomenon itself is widening its reach, or whether society is simply offering more room to speak. At the center of that tension is the evolving demographic profile of abductions, which, for the first time, looks like it is expanding far outside its old boundaries. The expansion of abduction demographics. For many years, abduction research carried a narrow picture of who was supposedly involved. Reports were often linked to isolated individuals in rural regions, reinforcing a stereotype of witnesses who lived on the margins of society. That image shaped both popular culture and the way officials dismissed the subject, framing it as something confined to small communities with little broader relevance. But the broader collection of reporting mechanisms that emerged in 2024 and 2025 paints a different outline. Civilian surveys, academic studies, and the case totals released through official channels suggest the profile of experiencers is widening far beyond those earlier boundaries. Rather than being confined to a narrow slice of the population, abduction accounts are now emerging across groups that previously appeared only in small numbers. Age is the first dimension where this widening is clear. Earlier testimony leaned toward people in middle adulthood, a demographic that dominated abduction archives for decades. But newer reporting shows younger individuals making up a larger share, especially people under 30. Many of these cases surface in urban contexts where social platforms and online networks make testimony easier to share. If younger experiencers were always present but less likely to speak out, the shift could reflect the presence of technologies and communities that encourage disclosure. The ease of documenting experiences through posts, informal networks, or digital surveys now lowers the isolation that once accompanied these kinds of accounts. Coupled with new reporting mechanisms like ARO's intake system and survey projects such as Sky Canada, there are simply more accessible outlets in place today than in earlier decades. Geography adds another layer. While the cultural image of the abductee once centered on lonely roads and remote farmhouses, recent reporting skews more toward metropolitan areas. Surveys now record encounters taking place in apartment complexes, student housing, and public urban spaces. Some accounts even cite interference with phones, wearables, or data streams during the reported events. Rural testimonies still occur, but the overall balance has tilted toward dense, connected settings where people carry multiple devices and communicate through digital platforms. This doesn't necessarily mean abductions have migrated to cities. It may be that visibility has increased because urban residents are more comfortable and better equipped to share what happened. Another notable expansion is cultural diversity within experiencer reports. Historically, abduction literature concentrated on accounts from English-speaking white populations in the United States and parts of Europe. That narrow sampling left many voices absent. By contrast, more recent collections, especially those tied to diverse cities, include testimonies from Hispanic, Asian, and Black experiencers, along with communities outside the traditional centers of research. Some of these testimonies mirror long-standing motifs of missing time, altered environments, and encounters with beings. Others include unique details or framing bound to particular cultural perspectives. The effect is not to erase earlier consistencies, but to broaden the sense of representation. When public surveys like Sky Canada's show participation across demographics, it suggests many groups have always carried these stories but face stronger barriers to recognition or serious study. These shifts raise an essential question. Are we witnessing a genuine expansion of the phenomenon itself, or do these changes primarily reflect better reporting conditions and reduced stigma? Both interpretations remain plausible. On the one hand, it's possible abductions always crossed more lines of age, culture, and geography than the older data implied, but participants lacked meaningful opportunities to share. Scholarly discussions now stress how stigma shaped decades of silence. Speaking of abductions often meant risking ridicule. On the other hand, some argue that the concentration in new groups, especially in highly connected urban populations, may signal that the phenomenon has adjusted in its presentation or manifestation. Neither conclusion is definitive, and the available data cannot determine intent. At present, the most reasonable summary is that the reporting pool is widening, and whether that represents an underlying expansion or newly visible populations remains unanswered. Another feature of 2025 reporting is the rise in testimonies from younger men in urban contexts. Surveys show this group contributing heavily to the recent growth in abduction accounts across multiple city regions, suggesting it is more than a scattered anomaly. Researchers hesitate to say whether this points to any targeting, but the consistency across datasets makes the change difficult to dismiss outright. What explains it is still uncertain. It might reflect how young men are often heavy users of technology and social platforms, giving them more avenues to capture or communicate their experiences. The structure of their testimonies, encounters reported after late-night shifts, ride-hailing work, time spent in shared housing, or while moving through dense city environments, reveals continuity with earlier patterns but grounded in different life settings. Reports from women also appear with greater frequency than earlier decades suggested, especially in diverse urban communities. While men still feature prominently in some of the newest datasets, a steady rise in female experiencers challenges assumptions about who these events affect most. Several researchers have pointed out that earlier underrepresentation of women may have resulted from the stigma surrounding bodily or intimate descriptions of contact. An environment that now offers more formal and informal reporting paths may explain the more balanced distribution of recent years. Although not yet equal, the closer alignment between genders weakens prior caricatures of who abduction experiencers are supposed to be. At the same time, we should recognize what these datasets cannot tell us. Baseline information is limited, and most public surveys do not capture verified demographic percentages with precision. For instance, Sky Canada's UAP survey revealed a sizable number of respondents who reported sightings, but many also admitted they did not know where incidents should be reported at all. That single detail helps frame why abduction reports might increase among younger and urban groups. People familiar with apps or social media may simply have clearer avenues for documenting their accounts than older or more rural populations. Increased reporting does not necessarily mean more abductions are happening today. In many cases, it may mean that marginalized voices are finally gaining their first points of entry into the public record. That context reinforces the need for caution about interpretation. Expansion in the datasets could represent two different, but equally important realities. Either the phenomenon has always been this diverse, hiding beneath social barriers that once made disclosure nearly impossible, or the phenomenon itself has shifted in reach in recent years. Both scenarios carry consequences for how researchers and governments frame future investigation. If abductions are an old constant finally becoming visible, then the staggering implication is how much has gone unrecorded. If new populations are genuinely being drawn into the pattern, then the scale of change is equally disruptive. What matters most is how this demographic broadening affects the way abductions are treated in public discourse. No longer comfortably dismissed as reports from rural fringes, they show up in metropolitan survey instruments and formal data releases. That makes it harder to quarantine the phenomenon within a narrow psychological or cultural category. As long as reports now cut across multiple ages, genders, and ethnic groups, abductions gain the contours of a subject that reflects social diversity as a whole rather than a niche subculture. Each incremental widening affects the debate in ways earlier decades never anticipated. When colleges, universities, research institutes, and survey projects find themselves archiving abduction experiences in urban centers and across varied demographics, the profile shifts from a cultural curiosity to an embedded population phenomenon. Whether rooted in new levels of disclosure or genuine changes in occurrence, the result is the same. The idea of who might encounter something anomalous has broadened dramatically. As these demographic shifts accumulate, one further question begins to surface. If abductions are becoming part of a collective dataset across different populations, why do the numbers appear to rise at particular moments rather than unfolding evenly year by year? Witnesses are speaking from more diverse backgrounds, but the timing of when these testimonies escalate has its own peculiar story to tell. That perspective opens onto another dimension of the record, where the rhythm of reports seems to align with moments of official disclosure in ways too regular to ignore. Encounter patterns and the disclosure timeline. One of the more intriguing aspects of abduction reports is not just what is being described, but when those accounts emerge. Over the decades, researchers have noticed that increases in reporting often take place around the same time as major publicity or disclosure events. While some early discussions framed this as a mysterious synchronization, more recent analysis, both from official sources like the Pentagon's All-domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, and from journalists, attributes much of the increase to very human dynamics: heightened awareness, reduced stigma, and more platforms for people to share their stories. In its FY24 report, AARO specifically noted that higher numbers of reports were being filed as awareness grew and as reporting mechanisms became easier to access. These details suggest that what looks like a sudden rise in abduction testimonies is often closely tied to publicity cycles rather than unexplained forces at work. To understand this relationship, it helps to set out three research-informed hypotheses that can explain why these correlations keep appearing. The first hypothesis is straightforward. Disclosure lowers stigma, which encourages people to speak. After government hearings or widely circulated press coverage, experiencers feel less at risk of being dismissed, so testimonies that had been held back find their way into public channels. The second hypothesis emphasizes the media's role in shaping memory. Coverage of official cases, especially striking visuals like cockpit footage, may act as a mental trigger leading individuals to reinterpret or finally voice experiences they had suppressed. This framing was widely discussed after the 2017 New York Times reports, when abduction testimonies increased noticeably in parallel with dramatic news coverage. The third hypothesis is more cautious. Reporting increases could coincide with disclosure events without any direct causal link, reflecting unrelated social or technological shifts such as new online groups, easier access to digital surveys, or the simple clustering effect of people paying attention at the same time. None of these explanations rules the others out. They may interact, reinforcing the impression of a tight link between disclosure and experiencer surges. Looking back to the 1970s, we see one of the earliest episodes of this perceived alignment. Decades later, records confirmed that classified programs were underway exploring new surveillance technologies and cataloging anomalous aerial observations. As this classified work ticked upward, news stories about strange encounters began circulating in parallel. People who said they had previously remained silent started to give testimony more openly, and abduction-like narratives began surfacing in greater numbers. While at the time no formal connection was drawn, researchers later identified these overlapping trends as an early example of disclosure, however indirect, being met with a surge in experiencer reports. This early case shows how institutional activity and public testimony can appear to move in step, even without anyone claiming causation outright. The best documented case, however, remains 2017. When the New York Times published its revelations about a Pentagon program monitoring unidentified aerial phenomena, the impact was measurable. Aircrew videos, radar records, and high-profile sources catalyzed mainstream media interest. Within months, researchers across clinics and private organizations noticed a visible increase in abduction accounts. Many experiencers explained their reasons clearly. Seeing prominent authorities speak openly about strange craft made them believe their own stories would no longer be dismissed out of hand. Here the hypothesis about stigma reduction found strong support. The publicity did not create the experiences but opened the social space for them to be shared. Now in 2025, the pattern seems to repeat. Within 2 weeks of a major Pentagon hearing and data release, national reporting showed a spike in new testimonies. Online groups and survey projects recorded unusually high activity, in some cases citing double the intake of typical weeks. While early numbers are always provisional, the alignment in timing recalls both the late 1970s and the 2017 wave. The clustering effect is difficult to dismiss, especially when it has occurred more than once across very different media environments. Still, officials and many researchers frame this rise as a cultural response to disclosure, not fresh proof that the phenomenon itself is reacting to politics. This brings us to the deeper debate. Are these correlations a loop between disclosure and testimony, or does one consistently drive the other? 3 working views frame the options. View A: disclosure lowers stigma, making experiencers more willing to report. This view is strongly supported by both official statements and prior case studies. View B: seeing imagery and reports in mass media revives previously hidden memories, prompting a sudden wave of self-recognition. This view has precedent in psychological research into memory recall under conditions of heightened cultural focus. View C: the clustering may reflect unrelated but overlapping social conditions, such as new technologies, the rise of forums, or the steady accumulation of accounts that happen to surface in response to broader attention. Each has merit, and none can yet claim the full picture. There is also a more speculative idea that some researchers occasionally raise, that surges in experiences may actually precede disclosure, as though the underlying phenomenon itself exerts pressure that eventually forces governments to respond. This suggestion is provocative, but it is important to flag it as speculative only. No verified data supports causation in this direction, and it remains a hypothesis to be tested rather than a finding to be assumed. Its appeal comes from the repeating rhythm of events, where major testimony spikes sometimes cluster tightly on either side of official announcements, but the interpretation rests in the realm of theory, not confirmed fact. What is clear is the striking persistence of the cycle. Graphs that overlay disclosure milestones with case filings create wave-like patterns visible across decades. Public testimony ebbs and then spikes again, often near official data releases. Even if this quantity is explained primarily by awareness and stigma reduction, the consistency itself demands attention. For experiencers, the link matters less for causation than for visibility. Each new disclosure window seems to provide an opportunity for voices that had remained quiet to finally step forward. The most recent surge in early 2025 underscores this. Families reported multiple overlapping experiences in the same time frame. Younger witnesses contributed first-time testimonies in the days surrounding the Pentagon hearing. Reports clustered in a way that, as private research groups noted, mirrored the earlier 2017 curve. The details and settings differ, influenced by new demographics and technologies, but the pattern of clustering connected to high-profile events has remained intact. For analysts, this recurrence confirms that the disclosure timeline is not only a story of institutions reluctantly releasing data, it is also a story of how humans choose when to speak and how media environments shape those choices. The cycle can reasonably be described as a feedback loop. Public disclosure encourages testimony, expanding pressure, which in turn brings about new levels of disclosure. Each part feeds into the other, resulting in bursts of activity rather than steady, linear growth. Depending on which hypothesis applies most strongly in a given instance, the primary driver may change, but the visual pattern in the timeline looks remarkably steady. It is this rhythm, the echo between institutional acknowledgement and personal narrative, that makes the abduction record so distinctive. Yet even as researchers debate the mechanics of this loop, the implications stretch further. If testimony always surges in step with official disclosures, then the very content of these encounters may be shaped by context. How experiencers describe beings, craft, or procedures may carry signatures of the era, imprinted in the way testimony surfaces. This possibility inserts a new set of questions into the debate. Are certain recurring images or motifs within abduction accounts, like the shapes of beings or the focus on biological procedures, responding to disclosure cycles as much as they are responding to anything external? And this opens the path toward the next area of inquiry. Some researchers argue that the consistency of these motifs could point less to extraterrestrial visitors and more to reflections of ourselves. Instead of looking outward, they suggest it may be time to consider whether abduction imagery connects to a human story, our development, our future, and what role we might play in producing the very patterns that seem so alien at first glance. Michael P. Masters and the Future Human Hypothesis. One perspective that pushes the conversation in a very different direction comes from anthropologist Michael P. Masters and what he has called the Future Human Hypothesis. Rather than interpreting abduction testimonies as encounters with extraterrestrials or interdimensional visitors, Masters argues that the beings experiencers described could be distant descendants of our own species. According to this speculative framework, the figures with large heads, thin jaws, and elongated bodies may not originate from the stars at all, but from the trajectory of human evolution thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of years ahead. It is not presented as fact, nor as consensus science, but as one of several competing hypotheses, alongside extraterrestrial, interdimensional, cryptoterrestrial, and psychosocial explanations, that some researchers and experiencers find compelling enough to explore. The physical traits reported in abduction narratives form the cornerstone of Masters' reasoning. Experiencers often describe wide eyes, slender limbs, and reduced mouths. These traits happen to echo features that anthropologists sometimes include in future-orientated evolutionary models. For example, current research notes shrinking jaw sizes over the last several millennia due to changes in diet and food preparation. Predictions suggest this reduction could continue, resulting in smaller, less pronounced mouths and less prominent chewing structures. Witnesses describing beings with extremely thin lips or vestigial mouths appear to align symbolically with these trends. However, mainstream anthropology does not endorse the time travel claim itself. At most, the comparison yields a provocative overlap between emergent biological projections and testimonies gathered over decades. The eye question is a case in point. Testimonies often describe beings with unusually large, dark eyes. Some future-oriented models speculate that in environments with unstable climate or heavy reliance on artificial lighting, selective pressures could favor people with larger ocular capacity to adapt to dimmer conditions. Though speculative, this overlap makes the reports harder to dismiss as random imagination. Masters and others point out that these consistencies raise questions worth testing, even if the answers remain theoretical. And while there are multiple ways to interpret such imagery, psychological symbolism, cultural influence, unconscious memory cues, the visual descriptions dovetail neatly enough with projected adaptations to remain part of the debate. Body structure provides another angle. People already live in environments that encourage lower muscle demands, and high dependence on technology. Abductees frequently describe beings that are slender, frail-seeming, and built more for cognitive endurance than physical strength. Projections of human evolution in conditions of reduced manual labor and advanced medical intervention suggest long-term decreases in overall muscle density. Reports of elongated limbs and narrow bodies may reflect exaggerations of these same forces. Again, these alignments are not proof. They are comparative parallels that illustrate why Master's hypothesis continues to attract discussion, even if most anthropologists remain cautious, emphasizing just how tentative any long-range model must be. By 2025, interdisciplinary workshops have occasionally experimented with placing these anthropological models alongside abduction testimony. The purpose isn't to validate time travel or cement the future human hypothesis, but to treat the testimonies as potential data points for comparison. In such settings, evolutionary biology, anthropology, and cognitive science teams have shared simulations that happen to bear resemblance to experiencer accounts. While the groups avoided endorsing the hypothesis outright, the act of testing morphology against testimony reflects a gradual shift toward considering experiencer material in structured environments. No consensus has been reached, but the very fact such comparisons are occurring is new. Another feature of Master's framework is the suggestion that beings described as collecting biological samples or engaging in reproductive procedures could belong to a population focused on long-term survival. Interpretively, future humans might reach back to stabilize genetic diversity during a period of ecological challenge or disease collapse. In this thought experiment, abductions would serve conservation rather than conquest. This reframing does not erase the trauma endured by experiencers, but it changes the intent from predation to preservation. A speculative, if true, exercise follows naturally here. If governments suspected abductions signaled interventions by future humans, how might that alter disclosure strategies? Would officials present the phenomenon differently if it represented temporal continuity rather than alien intrusion? Critics counter that projecting thousands of years of change into future human physiology is inherently unstable. Anthropological projections can't claim precision on such timescales, and matching these models to abduction accounts risks confirmation bias. They emphasize that no empirical evidence links these reported beings with time travel, and that mainstream science treats such claims as speculative at best. Yet the persistence of consistent imagery across decades, generations, and cultural settings does create pressure. Testimonies from children and adults far removed from academic debates continue to describe figures with the same broad morphology. That stability keeps the conversation alive even in skeptical circles. The discussion highlights a broader methodological point. Abduction research increasingly compares testimony not only against cultural symbols or psychological patterns, but also against long-term anthropological models. Whether or not Master's concept holds, it demonstrates how abduction narratives have entered the orbit of disciplines that once ignored them. Anthropologists who engage with his framework do so not by validating time travel, but by testing whether cultural reports align with any evolutionary projections that biology can model. In that respect, Master's hypothesis has functioned more as a provocation toward interdisciplinary comparison than as a theory enjoying widespread acceptance. For experiencers, the idea introduces interpretive room. To conceive abductors as future humans rather than extraterrestrials shifts how one narrates the experience. The sense of violation may remain, but notions of intent and context change. The imagery becomes bound up with questions of human survival, adaptation, and self-preservation. For viewers and readers, treating the hypothesis as an if-true scenario offers a way to think beyond the extraterrestrial framing. If it were true, what would it mean about time, agency, and the strategies of governments handling this material? These counterfactuals keep the hypothesis relevant, even as it remains speculative and far from consensus science. Ultimately, the future human hypothesis sits at the edge of abduction discourse as a thought experiment that floats between experiencer testimony and anthropological modeling. The images of large heads, thin jaws, expansive eyes, and slender limbs may just as easily stem from psychology or media influence, but their overlap with certain evolutionary projections ensures the topic stays on the table. It is not mainstream, but it remains in discussion because the resemblance is hard to ignore. What happens next depends on how new research intersects with these ideas. As more data accumulates, whether demographic surveys, clinical studies, or material samples, the ability to test or rule out different hypotheses will strengthen. Master's suggestion serves mainly to broaden the interpretive field beyond extraterrestrials. Even if it never secures acceptance, it has prompted new routes of questioning about what abduction accounts might signify. And while morphology and projected evolution provide thought-provoking comparisons, skeptics continue to remind the field that resemblance is not evidence. This sets the stage for the next major tension in the debate. While models and testimonies can suggest possible explanations, critics return to a single demand: evidence that stands outside subjective narrative. For decades, detractors have argued that abduction claims collapse whenever physical proof is required. No photographs, no incontrovertible traces, nothing that survives careful review. It is at this crossroads, between imaginative hypotheses and the demand for verifiable data, that the next turn in the abduction story takes shape. Advances in physical evidence analysis. For a long time, the sticking point in the abduction debate has been the lack of tangible proof. Testimonies could be striking, even consistent, yet when investigators looked for physical evidence, the results rarely held. Alleged implants turned out to be bits of glass, shrapnel, or dental amalgam. Trace materials collected at alleged encounter sites, often dissolved under scrutiny as common soil or industrial byproducts. The line was simple: stories exist, but evidence does not. That shaped the cultural dismissal of abduction accounts for decades. What makes 2025 different is not that perfect proof suddenly appeared, but that new tools now allow smaller, subtler anomalies to surface. Anomalies that earlier generations couldn't detect or analyze. Trace material analysis is the most visible arena of progress. In the past, fragment samples tied to alleged encounters were often delivered to labs without proper handling. Contamination blurred results, and conventional testing methods lacked the resolution to separate genuinely odd signals from background noise. By 2024, AI-driven spectrographic systems became part of the toolset. These systems excel at isolating unusual isotopic or elemental ratios amid billions of data points. Material once written off as inconclusive is now re-examined with algorithms trained to flag outliers. Many samples still return ordinary results, but some resist easy categorization, producing signatures that do not match common industrial products. Investigators stress that interpretation remains cautious. Some anomalies could still come down to unknown contamination or manufacturing oddities. Nevertheless, the fact these results are emerging in structured reanalysis rather than fringe labs lends them weight they did not previously carry. Implants sit at the center of controversy. Dozens of experiencers have reported small metallic or ceramic-like objects embedded in their bodies, often discovered during medical scans or surgeries. For decades, these claims prompted ridicule, partly because most objects turned out to align with ordinary materials. Yet some investigators persisted, subjecting the objects to advanced testing. Recent years brought isotope ratio mass spectrometry into the process, a method sensitive enough to detect tiny variations in isotopic makeup that could suggest unusual origins. In certain cases, investigators have pointed to deviations from common Earth ratios. At the same time, critics caution that these results are contested, sometimes lacking strict chain of custody or replication by independent labs. The background history reveals how many implants turned out to be terrestrial once analyzed thoroughly, reinforcing why skepticism remains central. Reports of anomalies exist, but there is no replicated, peer-reviewed demonstration of non-terrestrial material tied to experiencers. Biological and neurological testing has added a new layer of inquiry. For many years, abduction witnesses were dismissed as psychologically suggestible. But clinical research since 2024 has identified differences between experiencer populations and control groups. High-resolution fMRI and EEG scans show recurring patterns of brain activity, particularly in temporal lobe regions linked to sensory integration and memory processing. These clusters have appeared across multiple subjects, persisting even in repeat testing. While the findings do not prove abductions occurred, they suggest that experiencers share measurable neurological traits not typical in the wider population. Researchers debate whether these differences reflect predispositions, consequences of unusual stress, or genuine interactions of unknown kind. What matters is that the biological markers are being published in academic or clinical settings, making it harder to wave them away as fantasy alone. Immune responses are another detail that has caught attention. Some experiencers show elevated markers of inflammation or irregular immune activity shortly after reported encounters. Medical teams note that these anomalies surpass random fluctuations seen in matched control groups. One study tracked blood profiles taken within a week of claimed experiences and consistently logged unusual readings. Again, this is not definitive, but the clustering challenges assumptions that all cases can be explained by suggestion or imagination. If abduction stories are purely cultural artifacts, skeptics must explain why immune system irregularities occur at a higher than expected rate in those who report them. The critic's case remains strong in one respect: no single anomaly can serve as proof. Stress, error, or unrecognized social factors could still shape the outcomes. What differentiates recent studies is how multiple streams begin to overlap. The same individual who has an object with disputed isotope ratios may also display unusual brain activity and immune response. This convergence across separate investigative modes raises the evidentiary value above what anecdotes alone could provide. Investigators caution against claiming answers, but they emphasize that the consistency across domains is what justifies further funding and study. Yet the landscape remains fraught. Reports of exotic isotope signatures circulate, but independent verification is missing. Labs with strict controls frequently find ordinary explanations once industrial origins or contamination are considered. The Department of Defense's ARO office made its position clear. Despite analyzing hundreds of cases, it has found no evidence of extraterrestrial technology or biology. From a scientific standpoint, that official position highlights the magnitude of the gap between contested claims and validated findings. While anomalies do appear, they have yet to survive the rigorous hurdles of replication, independent review, and transparent chain of custody that mainstream science demands. That is why chain of custody procedures have become so crucial in 2025. Investigations now document sample history step by step, from collection to lab testing, to eliminate doubts introduced by unsecured handling. Without that transparency, even the most intriguing anomaly risks being dismissed outright. Similarly, replication remains the gold standard. A single lab claiming outlier results is not enough. Multiple labs must reach the same conclusion independently for a case to move forward. Critics argue that until this standard is met, physical evidence in abduction research cannot be considered credible proof. Advocates counter that these steps are finally underway and represent progress, even if final confirmation takes years. The conversation also reflects cautious optimism among researchers. Advanced forensic methods offer possibilities that earlier decades simply could not. Mass spectrometry, once reserved for nuclear materials, now allows isotopic comparisons at scales unimaginable in the 1980s. Machine learning opens detection of trace anomalies too subtle for human interpretation. Neuroimaging tools provide high-resolution readings of brain function across diverse groups. These technologies may not provide definitive proof yet, but they dramatically sharpen the signals available for analysis. The difference lies in the capacity to test and retest with precision, which is the necessary condition for building credibility in a field weighed down by skepticism. At the same time, these improvements highlight why exaggerated claims can erode trust. Past stories of non-terrestrial metals circulated widely only to collapse under testing that revealed common alloys. Today, transparently reported results emphasize limits. Researchers explain what is unusual about a sample, but also publish caveats about contamination or limited sample size. This sober, careful presentation is itself a change from earlier decades when sensational claims dominated popular coverage. The more the work resembles ordinary scientific caution, the stronger its claim becomes to serious consideration. The stakes remain high. For experiencers, having physical data associated with their testimony is validation long denied. For skeptics, anomalies that survive rigorous review are the only route to treating abduction claims as something beyond psychological or cultural artifacts. Both sides recognize that if truly unexplainable material evidence were confirmed, the conversation about abductions would shift dramatically within science and government. So far, that confirmation has not arrived. What exists instead is a scattered but growing body of signals pointing to differences worth examining. Material samples that defy immediate categorization, neurological markers clustering in unexpected ways, and immune responses measured at unusual rates. Each finding invites attention, but only collectively and repeatedly verified results will move the discussion out of the disputed margins. The simplest way to summarize the state of the evidence is this: physical traces remain the holy grail, promising, but not yet independently verified in a way that satisfies mainstream science. New technologies are unlocking sharper ways to examine claims, but a conclusive demonstration that abductions leave measurable, repeatable traces has not been achieved. It is precisely this tension between signals of interest and the demand for replicable proof that defines the field at this moment. And it underscores one further point: physical and biological studies represent only part of the puzzle. Beyond material traces, attention has shifted toward technological observations that can place encounters in a broader context. If abductions often sound subjective, events tied to defense tracking systems offer the possibility of objective corroboration. A next turn in the story now beginning to unfold. Technological leaps in UFO tracking. Where past testimony could only be weighed by word of mouth, the present moment introduces something different. Instruments sensitive enough to detect anomalies and compare them with what people say they experienced. This is where technological leaps in UFO tracking become central. For the first time, advanced defense and civilian systems are providing records that stand apart from memory or narrative. Instead of relying solely on hypnosis or personal accounts, analysts now have access to radar returns, satellite signatures, and AI-driven cross-checks that supply independent reference points. Some of the most discussed upgrades are tied to ARO's planning around the Gremlin sensor architecture. Gremlin is designed as a networked system capable of consolidated monitoring across domains, integrating radar, infrared, and optical feeds without the gaps that used to exist between separate instruments. Alongside Gremlin, independent research groups have introduced specialized approaches. One example is the pixel-by-pixel analysis system developed by physicists under the CTAP project, using AI to comb through raw video and locate anomalies missed by human review. And universities play a role too. The Harvard-led Galileo project has set up autonomous camera and radar stations to track aerial unknowns with scientific transparency in mind. Together, these initiatives illustrate the depth of investment now committed to observation rather than speculation. The radar side of the equation has made important strides. In late 2024, enhanced radar cross-section systems were activated, offering sharper discrimination between clutter, weather, and objects under power. Previously, radar operators confronted fleeting blips that vanished without detail. With new configurations, traces persist long enough for recording and classification, producing datasets defense analysts can compare across time. The difference means that small, fast-moving craft, once indistinguishable from natural phenomena, are more likely to be logged with precision. These adjustments don't prove that such objects are non-human, but they do reduce the blind spots that critics once used to dismiss radar altogether. Satellite observation forms the second layer. Originally designed for climate monitoring, orbital platforms have been recalibrated to capture shifts in infrared bands, plasma events, and other electromagnetic anomalies associated with rapid aerial movement. The key gain lies not only in detection but in coordination. Satellite data is now increasingly linked with ground radar monitoring, building two perspectives on the same event. By early 2025, defense teams had produced combined reports in which radar locks and orbital readings overlapped. In certain cases, both indicators tracked objects displaying flight profiles inconsistent with known aircraft. Such reports don't make definitive claims about origin, but do establish that physical sensors sometimes corroborate eyewitness accounts. This converging function is known as data fusion, and its use has accelerated. Data fusion systems pull in disparate streams, radar angles, infrared spikes, optical images, even acoustic readings, and cross-reference them until overlapping signals isolate verified movement. An isolated blip, once written off as error, becomes more persuasive when another system registers the same coordinates at the same interval. AI integration accelerates this process, instantly matching anomalies across databases. The result is fewer false positives and a smaller chance of dismissing consistent but faint signals. Analysts note that where once reports hinged upon a single proof point, now multiple systems collaborate to establish a clearer track. What stands out most is how these advances apply to real datasets. AARO's 2024 report noted over 1,600 UAP cases under evaluation, with 21 identified as especially puzzling. Cases supported by multiple sensors or video alongside corroborating witnesses. Not every report reaches this standard, but its existence demonstrates that multi-sensor records are now documented at the federal level. These incidents haven't been officially described as abduction-linked, but the fact that hardware data, witness accounts, and video align in a subset of cases shows the potential relevance. Instead of unverifiable stories circulating separately, evidence now comes in packages blending experience and instrumentation. In the broader landscape, civilian projects work alongside defense initiatives. The Galileo project, for example, installed its prototype observation station in Massachusetts, designed to capture continuous high-resolution video coupled with radar and multispectral readings. The team emphasized open science as a guiding principle, promising to publish data regardless of conclusions. Similar collaborations experiment with applying AI to massive sensor archives, scanning frame by frame for anomalies regulators or analysts may have overlooked. Although still in development, these methods push the discussion further from folklore and closer to empirical testing. Concrete examples help explain the stakes. Among the 21 unexplained AARO cases, some involved simultaneous recordings across multiple systems, radar confirming movement where video also caught unusual flight, and where witnesses on the ground reported visual contact. One widely circulated case in 2024 involved military aviators who tracked and filmed an object defying expected aerodynamics. Radar corroboration and multiple visual accounts meant it could not reasonably be dismissed as glare or instrument fault. While no link to abduction surfaced, the methodological framework is clear. Triangulation makes possible a type of validation that wasn't available before. That framework matters when asking how experience or testimony will be weighed going forward. For years, abductions were dismissed precisely because no objective measurement ever stood alongside memory. With systems like Gremlin, high-resolution satellites, and AI-driven video parsing, the environment is shifting. When reports in the future show overlap between experiencers' claims and sensor logs from defense systems, the old dismissal strategy weakens. This hasn't become routine in most abduction. Accounts still lack correlated sensor evidence, but the infrastructure now exists to check, and in some cases anomalies are being recorded in the same regions and time frames as witness testimony. The reorientation is as much cultural as technical. Researchers emphasize that multiple lines of data don't confirm extraterrestrial contact, nor do they settle what abductions are. What they do confirm is that unknown aerial phenomena can be measured, tracked, and archived with a degree of rigor absent in earlier decades. The importance lies less in proving one extraordinary theory, and more in securing points of reference where once there were none. In practical terms, that means abduction-related accounts no longer belong solely to the world of memory. They exist in an environment where cross-checking with increasingly sophisticated tools is possible. Critics continue to highlight the limits. A few dozen puzzling cases do not outweigh hundreds that resolve into drones, balloons, or environmental clutter. AI systems can introduce new error, finding false positives among noise. Fusion architecture still depends on analysts determining threshold values for what counts as anomalous. No dataset points definitively toward a non-human presence. AARO itself has consistently emphasized, no extraterrestrial explanation has been validated. The reassurance is that technology now makes those limits visible instead of leaving everything bundled as mystery. The pace of development suggests that 2025 may be remembered less for any one revelation and more for the establishment of permanent monitoring networks. If satellite eye correlation, radar upgrades, and AI pixel screening persist, incoming decades could accumulate a robust body of public domain records. Such systems allow researchers and defense specialists alike to focus on the small fraction of data that resists ordinary explanation, instead of wasting efforts separating birds and weather returns. This represents the kind of filtering that could finally settle whether anomalous encounters have consistent measurable correlates. For experiencers, this has a different significance. Knowing that independent monitoring exists offers reassurance their testimony can be checked against more than human skepticism. It doesn't guarantee validation, but it promises that extraordinary claims can at least be tested within a structured framework. For governments, the new systems provide transparency and accountability. For scientists, they create reproducible environments in which competing hypotheses, from human error to advanced craft, can be evaluated systematically. That is a fundamental change from the decades when testimony lived alone. What these advances cannot capture, however, is the human cost of the experiences themselves. While new systems can log objects in motion, they cannot chart the fear, the trauma, or the disorientation felt by individuals reporting abductions. And whether the evidence ultimately confirms or denies extraordinary interpretations, the personal impact remains. Understanding how these encounters affect lives, psychologically, emotionally, socially, requires another lens entirely, one that turns away from sensor records and toward the experiencers themselves. Psychological and social impacts on experiencers. What stands out most when listening to abduction accounts is not the technical detail of the events themselves, but the lasting strain they place on the individuals who report them. Experiencers consistently describe impacts that echo recognizable trauma syndromes, nightmares, disrupted sleep, panic in ordinary environments, and an ongoing sense of hypervigilance. Clinicians who have studied these cases note that the symptom profile often resembles post-traumatic stress disorder, even when the events being remembered are extraordinary or culturally stigmatized. This disconnect between the implausibility of the testimony and the plausibility of the trauma is what has drawn researchers to focus less on proving or disproving the phenomenon and more on understanding its effects on the human beings at the center of it. One of the strongest concepts to emerge from recent research is ontological shock. This describes a kind of rupture in a person's basic understanding of the world they inhabit. Abductees often report that they come away not simply disturbed by a singular event, but destabilized in their entire sense of reality. Daily life then becomes harder to process. For some, work responsibilities lose meaning. For others, relationships strain or collapse under the weight of disbelief or dismissal from partners. These subtle disruptions accumulate into severe outcomes. Elevated anxiety, chronic insomnia, and loss of coherence in personal identity are documented across interview transcripts, echoing patterns usually reserved for accident survivors or combat veterans. Controlled clinical studies in 2024 and 2025 moved closer to testing whether these experiences have measurable neurological correlates. Small samples of experiencers underwent EEG and fMRI monitoring during recall sessions. The results repeatedly indicated irregular brainwave patterns. Alpha rhythms tied to resting calm dropped sharply, while theta activity linked with vivid recall and stress intruded disproportionately. This neurological disruption seems to match what therapists reported hearing over decades, that memories related to abductions flood in suddenly and destabilize attention, harming cognitive regulation. The physiological data strengthened the case that people reporting these encounters were not just indulging in vivid imagination. Measurable changes in brain activity accompanied their accounts. Further support comes from earlier peer-reviewed work, such as that of Richard McNally and colleagues, which demonstrated that experiencers can produce physiological stress markers similar to trauma victims when recalling abduction memories. Skin conductance spikes and elevated heart rates appeared during recall, even though the memories themselves had no independent physical validation. These measurable indicators complicate the picture. They confirm that experiencers genuinely feel trauma, even if the events remain unverified. The challenge for clinical practice is to treat the symptoms without reinforcing potentially flawed memory reconstruction. Clinicians also flag complications in how experiencers retrieve and narrate their encounters. Some show higher scores on measures of fantasy proneness compared to average populations, which may shape how memories form or transform over time. Others report sleep paralysis episodes, known in medical literature to cause vivid, immobilizing hallucinations of presence, that are then interpreted as abductions. Skeptics argue that these findings resolve many cases, while supporters counter that they may only explain a portion. Both agree, however, that the overlap must be acknowledged if treatment aims to be responsible. Therapists consistently encounter the hurdle of stigma. Many experiencers carry their memories for years before speaking to anyone, fearing mockery or disbelief. Case studies from 2024 and 2025 reflect this hesitation. In Denver, a young woman cycled through counseling sessions for months before reluctantly revealing abduction experiences dating back to childhood. Once she spoke, EEG recordings documented abrupt spikes in activity consistent with high anxiety reactions, even though no external stimulus was present. Similarly, in Toronto, a middle-aged man undergoing guided relaxation repeatedly experienced panic episodes when describing missing time and overwhelming light. Clinicians present in both cases treated the responses not as evidence of extraterrestrial activity, but as objective indicators of unresolved trauma requiring therapeutic intervention. Anxiety and panic are not the only patterns reported. Identity disturbance has emerged as another recurring theme. Some experiencers describe feeling detached from ordinary humanity, as though transformed or set apart by contact. Others speak of struggling to maintain consistent personal meaning after repeated encounters. The effect spills into social domains, impairing work performance, eroding family stability, and generating long periods of isolation. In interviews, therapists now treat these disruptions as more than coincidence, noting their consistent presence across cases and settings. Professional organizations remain cautious. While some researchers have suggested frameworks to guide the treatment of experiencer trauma, no major psychiatric association has published official guidelines. Instead, discussions focus on best practices and on warnings about suggestive techniques. The American Medical Association has cautioned against hypnosis-based memory recovery, highlighting risks of implanting false memories. Scholarly reviews, like the Harvard Critique of Abduction Research in the 1990s, likewise argued that hypnosis and leading questioning can seriously distort recall. The lesson is clear: clinicians can acknowledge distress and offer support, but they must avoid methods that risk solidifying unverifiable narratives. The emphasis is on pragmatic care: address symptoms, reduce harm, and maintain critical awareness that memory is flexible and vulnerable to error. For experiencers, recognition that trauma itself can be validated without deciding on the reality of abductions is vital. Patients who once felt trapped between ridicule and silence increasingly find clinicians willing to treat the symptoms directly. This shift can reduce shame and open access to resources previously limited by stigma. For practitioners, engaging responsibly with experiencers means balancing two imperatives: compassion for psychological pain and methodological caution in how accounts are handled. By positioning abduction-related trauma within the broader spectrum of anomalous experience research, clinicians ensure that affected individuals are supported without collapsing into credulity. The social dimension amplifies these medical issues. Experiencers frequently report ostracism, ranging from strained marriages to damaged careers. In some cases, custody disputes or employment hearings have been influenced by assumptions that reporting abduction memories equates to delusion. Where clinicians emphasize that trauma symptoms are legitimate regardless of the factual status of events, it creates the possibility of reducing collateral harm. Legal and occupational systems may come to accept that distress exists in a gray zone, not proof of alien activity, but still worthy of humane response. Treatment studies have started to test which interventions help. Cognitive behavioral therapy has shown promise in addressing intrusive memories. Simple grounding techniques, including meditation and breath regulation, have correlated with reduced brainwave irregularities during laboratory study. These results remain early stage, but they suggest that standard trauma protocols can be adapted for experiencers with some positive impact. Rather than improvising case by case, researchers argue for compiling systematic records, cataloging what works and what does not. This is the groundwork for future care, even if official guidelines remain absent. The key lesson for families and clinicians alike is twofold. First, anomalous experiences can produce symptoms that are real, diagnosable, and disruptive, and sufferers deserve care with the same seriousness applied to other trauma survivors. Second, methods that attempt to extract hidden memories, especially hypnosis, carry risks of distorting reality and should be treated with caution. Humane clinical care paired with skepticism about memory recovery techniques offers a way forward that acknowledges distress without amplifying error. Experiencers often express relief when their private pain is treated as part of a broader research map rather than an isolated eccentricity. The knowledge that others display similar patterns, whether in neurological readings, anxiety markers, or identity disturbances, reinforces that they are not alone and not simply imagining symptoms. This recognition creates a foundation for community, as well as for more credible research. Over time, the convergence of clinical attention, social context, and responsible scientific critique may reframe abduction trauma from a fringe curiosity into a recognized category of human suffering worthy of structured response. As these clinical debates expand, they intersect with a wider landscape. Governments, military offices, and international institutions grappling with how to balance transparency, credibility, and public trust. The psychological strain borne by experiencers may be local and personal, but the question of how societies respond to encounters with the anomalous has already begun to spread far beyond private therapy rooms. The global picture, international disclosure efforts. When conversations about UFOs and abductions come up, the focus usually turns to the United States. Washington's hearings, Navy pilots' testimony, and ARO's reports occupy center stage in international coverage. Yet by 2025, that framing looks incomplete. Around the world, other governments and civil organizations are releasing material and maintaining official programs that add their own layers of credibility. These efforts do not all follow the same model, but they collectively show that disclosure is no longer an American-controlled narrative. It is a global one. Brazil illustrates this shift clearly. In 2024, the Brazilian Defense Ministry made available a collection of archival materials, including case files where abduction reports were logged alongside aerial incidents. Officials did not describe these testimonies as proven, but including them in military archives marked a break from the tendency to avoid experiencer accounts entirely. By recording them as events worthy of acknowledgement, Brazil strengthened the boundary between rumor and record. Reports that might once have been disregarded as private anecdotes now entered the domain of state documentation, making dismissal harder. France represents a different, but equally important model. Through the NIS Space Agency, France has maintained its Gaipan office since the 1970s, archiving and analyzing reports related to unidentified aerial phenomena. In recent years, Gaipan has expanded public-facing databases and integrated testimony from witnesses, sometimes including abduction-related claims, under the broader category of associated phenomena. France does not present conclusions, but the archival framework signals that experiencer material belongs within the same system of review that handles aviation anomalies. This does not validate every case, it formalizes them as input. The significance lies in the institutional act of placing them on record for systematic evaluation. Chile presents another example of long-standing engagement. Its CIFA, Committee for the Study of Anomalous Aerial Phenomena, has been operating under the Directorate General of Civil Aviation for years. Few nations keep such a visible and consistent program within civilian aviation, but Chile has positioned itself as one of the most transparent. Officials there stress aviation safety first, but the archives also give experiencers a channel that many other countries lack. Case files range from pilot encounters to unexplained aerial activity witnessed by large groups, and Chile has maintained open communication about both. The steadiness of CIFA contrasts with the hesitant pattern of statements seen in other countries. Canada has also entered the picture. Through its Sky Canada project, launched in 2022 and expanded through 2023, researchers gathered public data on sightings and attitudes toward anomalous phenomena. By mid-2024, the project issued recommendations for further study and suggested practical steps for educating the public about reporting channels. Surveys included testimony across demographics, broadening the context for who reports encounters of unusual kinds. While Canada has not treated abductions specifically as a primary category, by normalizing widespread reporting it has framed a national baseline for how people engage with the issue. Japan has taken deliberate steps in its own direction. In 2024, officials released documents that included both service member and civilian accounts, some containing elements resembling abduction narratives such as missing time. The significance of Japan's contribution lies not only in publishing files, but also in calling for structured programs to handle experiencer material in ways that extend beyond aviation. Rather than limiting the issue to unexplained radar contacts, Japan has indicated openness to coordinated study involving both researchers and clinicians. This does not represent a formal global coalition, but it does open the door to multinational dialogue on how experiencers should be supported. For now, the direction is exploratory, signaling that parts of Asia are ready to engage publicly at a moment when the conversation elsewhere is fragmented. Placed together, these cases highlight that international disclosure is a patchwork. Brazil emphasizes cataloging, France emphasizes integration with aviation data, Chile emphasizes transparency under civil aviation safety, Canada emphasizes public engagement through surveys, and Japan experiments with frameworks that touch both scientific and clinical fronts. Rather than one coherent project, these strands form a multi-layered network. In some places, the momentum points toward transparency for the sake of trust. In others, the priority is aviation safety, institutional credibility, or scientific exploration. What unites them is that no one country maintains an uncontested lead. The United States continues to dominate global headlines because its hearings and whistleblower testimonies reach wide audiences, and ARO manages one of the largest repositories of UAP case files. NASA's independent study group has also added visibility within American science. But the association of disclosure with Washington oversimplifies a much more distributed reality. France's GAIPAN, Chile's CIFA, Canada's Sky Canada Project, and Japan's growing openness each build their own centers of gravity. Around them, India and Australia have entertained new research queries, and European nations with histories of cataloging sightings maintain local databases. These do not always make international headlines, but they matter for shaping the data landscape. The motives behind these efforts vary. Some governments emphasize national security concerns, ensuring aerial safety in civil and military spaces. Others lean into transparency as a way to maintain public trust and reduce speculation. Still others see scientific possibility in comparative analysis, gathering reports not for defense but for research in anthropology, psychology, or astronomy. No single motive dominates, and it is misleading to interpret the moves as a race for credibility. In reality, they are responding to different pressures: pressure from citizens, pressure from pilots, pressure from evolving science, and pressure from rising public interest. For experiencers, the differences carry direct consequence. A person in France filing an abduction account through GAIPAN has it archived in an official aerospace database. Someone in Chile finds their report flowing through a civil aviation pipeline. In Brazil, testimony may be visible within state defense archives. In Japan, new policies may soon provide access to coordinated support programs. In Canada, the survey-based structure at least offers acknowledgement that such claims exist across demographics. None of these systems provide a uniform process, but together they illustrate that experiencers are becoming visible internationally in ways long resisted in the United States. The unevenness of this landscape can be seen as both strength and weakness. Strength, because multiple countries experimenting with different disclosure formats ensures broader visibility than any one government could provide. Weakness, because without coordination, the data fragments and experiencers in one country may receive institutional acknowledgement while others remain isolated. Whether future years will bring tighter cooperation, for instance, multinational research frameworks or shared clinical guidelines, remains uncertain. For now, the picture is decentralized. Crucially, this decentralization pulls disclosure into a multilateral space. Instead of waiting for Washington to act, governments in South America, Europe, and Asia are now establishing independent traditions. This reshapes expectations in two ways. First, global transparency no longer waits on U.S. timing. Second, the legitimacy of experiencer testimony is now strengthened by international state-level acknowledgement, however tentative. The fact that different approaches exist, archival, clinical, or public-facing, means the subject cannot be dismissed as a local curiosity. It is now part of a worldwide record. What comes next may depend on how these diverse threads channel into global science. If Chile continues integrating testimonies into aviation safety protocols, if Canada builds on its attitudinal surveys, if Japan promotes cooperative research, and if France maintains long-term archival discipline, the cumulative picture may force science to respond with greater seriousness. Already in 2025, this combination of official databases, clinical interest, and public surveys has opened new ground for researchers outside defense or intelligence circles. International disclosure efforts therefore matter, not only for policy, but also for the directions they push research. Multiple nations defining different protocols makes it more difficult for science to ignore the subject or dismiss it as folklore. The presence of structured official archives, alongside grassroots surveys and clinical discussions, creates an evidentiary landscape more robust than any prior decade. Whether fragmented or coordinated, this mosaic ensures that no single country controls the storyline or monopolizes credibility. This widening frame leads directly to the next layer of inquiry: How formal science responds when abduction and experiencer cases shift from folklore and classified rumor into databases, medical studies, and multinational state channels. Once governments around the world preserve testimonies in official contexts, the spotlight turns to the scientific community, and the responses there have become a dividing line of their own. Scientific community reactions in 2025. As reports and archival files migrate into official channels, the scientific community in 2025 finds itself divided on how to respond. Some researchers argue that abduction testimonies now warrant careful study, while others believe including them risks weakening decades of hard-won scientific credibility. This divide is not hidden in closed seminars, but is increasingly visible at conferences, in journals, and across professional societies. Governments may frame their recent data releases in neutral terms, but scientists have to decide whether dealing with abduction cases counts as cautious inquiry, speculative overreach, or something best ignored entirely. Physicists and science communicators often emphasize consistency with established models. They highlight that claims of beings moving through solid matter or people transported across vast distances conflict directly with tested principles. Their position is anchored in a familiar maxim: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. From their perspective, the introduction of abduction testimony into the same arena as radar logs or isotopic material risks, conflating subjective memory with measurable events. They prefer to focus on verifiable detections, sensor radar data, AI scrutiny of videos, or forensic examination of trace materials. In that domain, methods exist to verify or falsify hypotheses. Human testimony, unless supported by instrumentation, remains outside what they consider science. Some also recall how Cold War disinformation muddied earlier UFO debates, citing it as another reason to demand the firmest standards. Yet neuroscientists and psychologists bring a different lens. Where physicists ask whether reported experiences can align with known laws of motion, neuroscientists ask what happens inside the brain during such encounters. Multiple labs have identified repeatable neurological activity linked to experiencers, including irregularities in the temporal lobes and heightened stress markers. Psychologists cite decades of controlled studies, such as false memory research, sleep paralysis evaluations, and trauma profiling, which demonstrate how subsets of experiencers display symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress even without external corroboration. From this viewpoint, abduction accounts become data because they consistently produce measurable patterns: elevated pulse during recollection, abnormal EEG rhythms, chronic dissociation markers. Whether or not the events themselves can be independently confirmed. Ignoring those measurements, they argue, abandons responsibility to understand real human suffering. This does not make neuroscientists and physicists opposites in conflict, so much as disciplines asking different questions. Physics asks, what do the claims mean for matter, energy, and location? Neuroscience asks, what is reporting such an event do to the brain and body? Anthropology asks, why do people in different cultures and generations describe such similar figures and procedures? Each discipline interrogates a piece of the puzzle, and those questions inevitably pull them in divergent directions. That divergence surfaced publicly in 2025 at conferences hastily arranged in response to the Pentagon's newest disclosures. Panels brought together researchers from several domains who rarely share a stage: anthropologists, neurologists, astrophysicists, and social scientists. Opinions differed. Some participants restated that abduction stories distract from measurable UAP detection, while others insisted they are central for understanding the human dimension of the phenomenon. From these events, a notable shift in language has emerged. Instead of debating alien abductions, sessions increasingly use terms like anomalous encounters or experiencer phenomena. This lexical change avoids unnecessary assumptions while acknowledging patterns in testimony. Removing loaded terms allows for dialogue where previously only ridicule held space. It signals that even without consensus, scientists are beginning to discuss abduction cases more openly, stripping the stigma from the vocabulary that once silenced inquiry. Anthropologists, in particular, underline the cultural puzzle. Comparing archives across decades, they note how children in different nations, with little shared exposure to the same media, describe figures with strikingly similar proportions and behaviors. Some interpret this as evidence of cultural archetypes that run deeper than entertainment. Others wonder whether there could be shared external stimuli. Either way, anthropologists argue that such global continuity is itself data. Human populations across time and geography telling remarkably similar stories, with recurring imagery and procedures. Whether symbolic or literal, the consistency is an anthropological problem worthy of study. Neurologists, meanwhile, are calling for more structured health monitoring of experiencers. They highlight fMRI studies conducted in 2024 that showed repeatable irregularities, not just one-off anomalies. Their proposals involve systematic casework, combining EEG monitoring, sleep studies, immune tracking, and psychological profiling to measure long-term effects. Some researchers stress that such programs could respond to experiencers' trauma, regardless of whether the phenomena are external events, cultural scripts, or neurological processes. A careful, clinical protocol without reliance on suggestive techniques like hypnosis has become an active point of discussion within professional bodies. While no official guidelines exist, there are increasing calls for risk-aware clinical practices that neither validate nor dismiss experiencers outright, but instead support them as trauma patients. Astrophysicists are traditionally wary, yet government data has drawn them closer. Pentagon archives indicate that some abduction reports cluster near the same regions and time frames as radar or infrared anomalies. This suggests value in cross-referencing personal testimony with sky monitoring records. A growing number of astrophysicists see ignoring this overlap as incomplete science, even if they remain cautious. At workshops, they have partnered with psychologists and anthropologists to propose frameworks for layered comparison. Instrument data matched with human narratives and long-term cultural surveys assembled into composite timelines. Such collaborations are still early stage, but they represent a break from past divisions. Concrete demonstrations of interdisciplinary activity already exist, even if not yet centered exclusively on abductions. NASA's independent study team, for example, has recommended standardized methods, data transparency, and peer review for anomalous sightings. Physicists analyzing detections, psychologists studying recall processes, and computer scientists applying AI video screening methods have cooperated in these sessions. While abduction testimony remains more tentative ground, workshops in 2025 are beginning to suggest parallel structures. Shared datasets, replicable tests, and comparisons across physical and experiential domains. Small pilot programs, though not yet formal coalitions, illustrate how collaborative approaches could mature if funding and institutional support expand. For experiencers, the sight of these conversations entering mainstream conferences shifts the landscape. While their accounts are still debated, the fact that specialists now discuss experiencer phenomena in academic contexts reduces the perception that the subject is taboo. For scholars, the issue becomes one of responsibility. Do they continue to sidestep testimony that resists current theory? Or do they design methods to study the measurable impacts while withholding judgment on ultimate cause? The scientific community is nowhere close to consensus in 2025. Skeptics caution that most historical implant studies or physical samples collapsed into ordinary explanations, so resources must be concentrated on rigorous detection. Others insist testable patterns in physiology and psychology justify dedicated long-term monitoring. In between is growing acceptance that abductee testimony consistently produces clinical and cultural data points, regardless of the underlying mechanism. That is not agreement, but it is recognition that blanket dismissal is losing ground. The implications are significant. Scientists willing to engage may reshape their disciplines by threading through difficult, ambiguous data, while skeptics pressing for traditional standards hold the line against overreach. The public watches these debates unfold in real time, and the field itself stands to gain or lose credibility depending on the balance struck. That divide matters because it decides whether abduction research is treated as fringe or as a legitimate problem scientists must measure and manage. And if the question of how to study abductions divides disciplines, another puzzle waits inside the testimonies themselves. Beyond the trauma symptoms and neurological irregularities lies the content of what experiencers describe. Encounters filled with peculiar images, recurring warnings, and messages that point back not just to the witnesses, but to humanity's trajectory as a whole. Implications for human evolution and future society. When researchers step back from the mechanics of individual encounters and look at the broader content, one theme stands out. Many experiencer narratives touch on humanity's future. The material is not only about descriptions of rooms, beings, or missing time. A striking portion contains messages or imagery tied to ecological concerns, war and conflict, or the survival of human genetics. These warnings do not appear uniformly, but they repeat often enough across decades that scholars find them worth tracking. The question is not whether they predict coming events, but why the same motifs appear across generations of experiencers regardless of cultural setting. Environmental messages form one of the most enduring threads. Reports going back to the 1970s include individuals describing images of barren landscapes, burning forests, oceans stripped of life, or skies choked with smoke. At the time, many skeptics dismissed them as projections of Cold War-era apocalyptic thinking. Yet as ecological crises took center stage in world politics, rising carbon levels, bleaching reefs, or wildfire seasons breaking records, researchers noticed similarities in timing. Correlations between spikes in ecological warnings and periods of heightened environmental alarm in the news do not prove foresight or intervention, but they establish a consistent overlap. Anthropologists studying these transcripts argue such narratives operate as cultural mirrors, amplifying the anxieties already circulating in society. In this view, abduction warnings reflect how individuals process collective fears rather than provide forecasts. That interpretation strengthens further when aligned with projects like Sky Canada, which highlighted how misinformation, media exposure, and cultural pressures shape public testimony about anomalous events. Conflict messages also appear repeatedly. Experiencers report visions of warfare, cities in flames, or populations devastated by weapons. During the Cold War era, that imagery centered on missiles and mushroom clouds. In the 2000s, some testimonies shifted to bombs, terrorism, and explosions in urban settings. In the last decade, experiencers described drones or advanced weaponry tearing through societies. Anthropologists and sociologists interpret this evolution in symbolic content as evidence that abduction imagery tracks historical anxieties. Each generation's experiencers render warnings in the vocabulary of their moment. Again, the presence of overlap with real-world events is not proof of causation, but it underscores how abduction narratives adapt in parallel with global fears. Scholars emphasize that correlating testimonies with political crises is valuable not because the encounters predict wars, but because they display how cultural stress seeps into anomalous narratives. The biological or genetic dimension takes the pattern into more personal territory. Across decades, abductees describe procedures involving reproductive material, biological sampling, or statements about human continuity. Messages suggesting that human genetic stability is fragile or requires preservation repeat across long spans of testimony. In earlier decades, such accounts fed speculation about hybridization or control. In more recent years, they align uncomfortably with scientific debates. Declining fertility rates in industrial nations, concerns about genetic diversity under climate stress, and new commentary on long-term survival pressures provide context that makes these warnings feel newly resonant. Researchers caution against calling the match predictive. Instead, they recommend treating the narratives as reflective, an echo of the broader social conversation, appearing through the lens of anomalous encounters. The point is not certainty about alien or temporal motives, but recognition that experiencers consistently narrate human fragility through genetic symbolism. This raises questions about how to interpret the intent of the experiences. Some researchers label the warnings guidance hypotheses, the idea that experiencers are being encouraged, even pressured, to recognize existential risks and change course. If such guidance were happening, we might expect recurring content across unrelated witnesses, a form of consistency beyond what cultural transmission alone would provide. Others frame manipulation hypotheses, suggesting that the warnings serve as coercion to condition populations into accepting narratives of fragility or dependence. Evidence to support this would require signs of coordination or demonstrable pressure built into the experiences themselves. At present, neither hypothesis has the empirical grounding to move beyond speculation. But attacking the problem in this way, by tying each reading to explicit, testable expectations, demonstrates how social science can bring structure to an otherwise ambiguous phenomenon. Tone and method of delivery increase the tension. Testimonies frequently describe warnings not as spoken words, but as images imposed on perception, vivid mental flashes of devastation, or silent thoughts dropped into consciousness. Psychologists note this format aligns with studies on intrusive imagery and how fear is reinforced through shocking visuals rather than argument. That association makes the testimonies more difficult to classify as either symbolic projections or external communication. The fact that multiple unrelated individuals describe images in this style, rather than only spoken messages, fuels continuing debates about how much of the experience is cultural coding and how much may involve neurological triggers still poorly understood. Recent comparative projects illustrate how scholars are handling these questions. One multi-decade compilation examined experiencer reports alongside historic crises. It did not claim prediction, but highlighted that ecological testimonies clustered during periods of environmental anxiety, that genetic worry spoke loudest during eras of fertility debate or pandemics, and that conflict imagery paralleled surges in global unrest. For psychologists and anthropologists, this is precisely why study matters. The narratives, regardless of literal truth, provide a running archive of how societies negotiate looming threat. Interpreted this way, abduction testimonies become a social barometer, one uniquely intense because experiencers insist the messages were delivered from outside themselves. Experiencers themselves often react with ambivalence when confronted with these patterns. For some, side-by-side comparisons bring comfort. Their private distress looks like part of a larger, recognizable trend. For others, the same realization amplifies unease. If so many unrelated people report ecological collapse or genetic fragility, then maybe the phenomenon is not simply a private hallucination, but part of something coordinated and possibly obligatory. The possibility that experiencers are being used as channels for communicating crises is unsettling, regardless of whether one interprets the origin as internal or external. Social scientists tend to emphasize that intent remains unknown. What can be studied are consistencies, correlations, and the psychosocial consequences. Abduction testimonies do not offer hard evidence about extraterrestrials, future humans, or interdimensional visitors. What they do offer is a longitudinal record linking private experiences with collective fears. Even when stripped of exotic frameworks, the recurrence of environmental decay, human self-destruction, and genetic instability points directly back to the challenges visibly shaping 21st century civilization. The credibility question may remain unresolved, but the thematic content gives researchers a way to analyze what abduction stories reveal about humans looking ahead to their own survival. The implications stretch outward. If ecological decay, weaponized conflict, and biological fragility dominate experiencer warnings, then at minimum these narratives already align with the issues governments, scientists, and societies must face in the present. They reveal something about how humans experience uncertainty in times of upheaval. They also highlight how fragile collective trust becomes when symbols of existential threat are encoded not only in public debates, but in anomalous testimonies that defy easy classification. Observed one way, this is cultural self-expression unconsciously amplified through vivid experiences. Observed another way, it feels like external reinforcement of the same urgent themes. Either path forces us to confront how entwined abduction discourse has become with human concerns about long-term survival. While skeptics caution that these motifs are nothing more than echo chambers for pre-existing anxieties, advocates insist the consistency across decades signals more than coincidence. The middle ground in 2025 is to recognize the value of study regardless of interpretation. Abduction testimonies, eclectic as they are, function as cultural artifacts mapping how societies frame impending risk. They do not predict, but they illustrate. And in illustrating, they challenge researchers, clinicians, and policymakers alike to ask why such themes recur so strongly even among people who have little contact or cultural overlap. In that sense, the phenomenon takes on significance whether one accepts abductions literally or not. The thematic warnings align uncannily with our most pressing problems, and they offer a distinct lens on how communities process existential dread. The takeaway is not only about aliens or time travelers, but about how seriously we regard the stories people tell when facing the possibility of collapse. Some researchers call for treating them as symbolic narratives of survival. Others leave the door open for something more. Both approaches sharpen the same conclusion: the content matters. Whether symbolic or literal, those warnings force us to ask how seriously we should take the phenomenon, and what we must do to both study it and support those affected. This insight opens directly to the broader perspective. If we zoom out from single experiences and trace the arc that stretches across decades, a larger narrative begins to emerge, one that challenges how isolated or coincidental these encounters really appear. When viewed as a whole, abduction reports no longer look like isolated stories. They form a repeating pattern that seems to move in parallel with official disclosure milestones. The unresolved question is why reporting spikes in government releases line up so often, and what mechanisms, greater awareness, political timing, or cultural momentum, might explain that correlation. ARO continues to stress that, despite hundreds of cases on file, no validated evidence of extraterrestrial technology has been found. That makes transparency and standardized reporting, alongside compassionate clinical support for experiencers, the most credible next steps. What explanation do you think best fits this recurring rhythm?